YouTube, what is good? It's your man Ribs from Doing Film Things. So we're back at it here with another test looking at C41 versus ECN2 once again. However, this time, instead of doing 500T or 800T as it's known by Cinestill, we're doing Cinestill 50D, which is a daylight film, very low ISO. That's good for kind of walking around on sunny days. So for this test, we did the same thing I did last time, which is in this video up above here. Check it out if you haven't watched it yet. But basically, I just kind of found a static scene and then I photographed it many times. I took a total of 6 shots and I bracketed one stop under and one stop above and obviously the middle exposure. And I did that twice and gave myself a bunch of space in the middle in order to cut the negative strip in the dark and then develop one half of that in ECN2 and develop the other half in C41. I did shoot it on medium format this time and I used this camera right here, my Agfa Isolet 3. And just to kind of change it up and see if something different would come out of that. So I did this test and I can't say I was surprised by the results. I think the results actually matched what I got in my last test, which again, you can watch in the video link up above here. But those results are very clear cut to me. Just by looking at the negatives kind of on a blind test, I could tell instantly which one was which. And I think that that's kind of the key thing you're gonna notice here right off the bat, just like before. So take a look at the negatives here. You'll see that the negatives actually look very different. And one set of negatives seems to be a bit more dense than the other. And that's kind of one of the telltale signals of developing in different ECN2 versus C41. Looking at this right here, can you kind of tell which one's which? Look at it, see how dark one is. Well, the answer is that the denser negative is actually the C41 negative. The less dense negative is the ECN2 negative. And again, that matches what we saw previously in my other test. So let's actually go ahead and look at the conversions for those negatives. Here you see 2 images side by side. One of them is ECN2 and one of them is C41. Can you tell which ones is which? No? Maybe? Well, I'll give you the answer, of course. The image on the right is actually the ECN2 negative and the image on the left is the C41 negative. And I think there's something very interesting to look at here. So I think the thing that instantly jumps out at me is the color of the highlights. If you look at the building and you look at the sunshine that's hitting it directly during golden hour, it truly does feel like a golden hour in the ECN2 conversion as opposed to the C41 conversion. And this is something I saw previously in the last test that I did where the highlights had a bit more warmth to them as compared to the highlights in the C41 image. The ECN2 highlights definitely had a bit more yellow, some of that warmth in there. And then the C41 highlights looked a bit more blue. And in this case, I don't mind the C41 image at all. I think it's a nice image, but looking at it by itself, you don't think anything's missing. But when you compare it to the ECN2 image, you see that some of that golden sunlight just doesn't show up as much. Honestly, I think I'd prefer something in the middle. And of course, you can edit these in post and kind of manipulate them as you please. But it's interesting to see how different the highlights look. And again, this is consistent. This is something we saw before. Looking at the rest of the image, you see a bit less of a distinction. So if you think about contrast, typically in a lot of my previous examples, I found that my ECN2 images were a bit flatter and had a little bit less contrast. It's actually less evident in this image here. And I think it's because it's such a high contrast scene to begin with. In this scene, you do have golden hour, so you're gonna have direct sunlight hitting something. And then whatever it's not hitting directly is gonna be very kind of dark. So you see that in both images, but maybe it's the eye tricking you, I'm not totally sure, but it actually seems like the ECN2 image has just a bit more contrast than the C41. But again, this might just be kind of the colors playing into it and making the highlights look that much more apparent as compared to the highlights in the C41. Other than that, I think you see that golden light kind of trickling around everywhere. If you look at the right side of the image, you'll see the bridge that has a bit of that highlight hitting it. And there you can definitely see that difference again. And actually, if you look at the shadow area of that bridge and compare both images, in the ECN2 bridge, it does have just a bit more warmth as well. And of course, this isn't the highlight of the image, this is kind of the midtones, maybe even the shadow. And it's evident there, which I think is very interesting. In the C41, if you look at the bridge kind of looks almost gray. It's almost missing something to make that green that the color is of the bridge pop. So, very interesting distinction there, but I'm glad to see that things are kind of following the same pattern, meaning that my experiments are actually controlled or as controlled as I can make them. Because again, not a perfectionist here, not a scientist. I'm just kind of trying to see what happens here with some practical tests. So if we actually move on to the prints, of course I have to print these in the darkroom to show you what negatives actually do when exposed to print paper. And this is where things get really, really interesting. So if we look at the 2 prints here, we've got one right here and we've got one right here. So looking at these two prints, you can kind of see some very, very immediate differences. This print right here has a much stronger kind of horizon. It's almost white. It really pops, and there's a lot of contrast in the sky. You get dark blue, you get that bright, almost white, and then again, you get really dark blue at the bottom. This print right here is basically much more even. The blue in the sky is consistently blue almost the whole way through, and the highlights aren't like exploding at you. And then of course, if you look at the highlights on the building, we see that difference again, whereas this one right here is a bit colder and this one right here is a bit warmer. So you tell me, which one is ECN2 and which one is C41? Well, the answer is this one is C41 and this one is ECN2. And here we really see those differences again. However, I think the contrast here is what's most interesting. The contrast difference is just really, really obvious. In this image, there's tons of contrast overall, but also if you look at the building itself. In this image here, you've got significantly less contrast across the whole image. And then if you look at the building itself, it almost looks mushy. There's almost very, very little difference between the highlights and the shadows on the building. So I think this really shows off that distinction that you'll typically see with the ECN2 negatives. They're much, much flatter, and they give you kind of that a logged look. It wasn't as obvious in the scan, interestingly enough. I feel like ECN2 really scans very nicely and gives you a nice kind of color palette right off the bat. But on the printing, this is where you really see the difference. And again, ECN2 process was designed for motion picture film. So here, those negatives really, really make the processes shine individually. I will say, I think I prefer this print right here for sure. And generally, I find that I always prefer the C41 style negative more for printing when I kind of do a head-to-head test. And here it's very, very evident. In some other photos, like the ones I showed you last week, it was less obvious. But in this one here, it's much more obvious. And again, I kept these very consistent. So these two images are using the exact same settings in terms of color. I didn't change that at all because I wanted to see what the distinction would be like. There was a big difference in exposure time. At f11, which is what I had my enlarger set to, this took about 7 seconds to expose right here. This is the 7-second exposure. And then this one was barely 2 seconds. I actually think this one was like just over 2 seconds. I kind of turned the dial just beyond the 2-second mark. If we look at other exposures for this, it actually is also very interesting. So this is a test exposure, which is why you see the line here, and it looks very messed up and there's some uneven developing, there's like a streak. But nonetheless, what this shows you also is here is some lighter exposure. So this is literally 1 second and this is 2 seconds flat, just kind of this times 2. And it's very evident here that the negative is still very, very flat. So you can kind of choose how dense you want the image to be. That 2-second range right on the dot gives you kind of an even exposure compared to the C41 exposure that I did at 7 seconds. But then you look at the image, at the print, and you just see so little contrast here. The highlights and the shadows almost blend into one, even though you have that strong golden light hitting the building. So very, very interesting here. I'm curious what a filmmaker would kind of react to this, because filmmakers who use film to shoot, they will see this process firsthand in terms of getting an ECN2 process negative, scanning it, and then messing with it in post. I'm also curious about people from back in the day who used to make print copies of these negatives. So they would take the negative, print it onto a positive film that kind of looks like slide film, and then that would be scanned to then go ahead and do something in the digital process. So again, it's really interesting to see the 360 here. Us photographers, film photographers, kind of get stuck in our film photography kind of point of view only, but you got to remember that these negative technologies were all connected and they all kind of originate from some core ideas, but then they're also designed specifically for other practices. Photographers do printing like this, and then filmmakers obviously make movies that nowadays especially are being turned into digital copies. So it's interesting to see how the negatives have evolved to fulfill those processes. So let me know in the comments, what do you think? Were you expecting to see such a drastic difference? Does this help you decide whether or not you want to go with ECN2 to process your Cinestill film? I don't know. I think, again, I'm going to stick to what I said before, which was process C41 and C41 and process ECN2 and ECN2. And again, it's the same film, Vision 3 is all of this, but Cinestill sells a product that they recommend you process in C41, so I'm going to keep doing that. And then if I'm shooting some Vision 3 film, kind of the raw stuff with the remjet, then I'll do the ECN2 process just to kind of keep it in its own lane. But there is no right answer here. It's just whatever you prefer and the look you prefer. All right, that's what I got for this week. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe. Until the next one, y'all. Peace.